Yeah, so I'm going to talk about open science, or networked science today. And I'm going to start with just a little story. It's a story. How many people are familiar with the Polymath Project in one way, shape, or form? Is there anybody? Okay, one person. So the story, it starts. How are we doing for the aspect ratio? Is that okay? It's okay? All right. It's a little unusual. So,
since we don't know what he looks like, it's hard to judge.
Well,
it's Julian Assange, right?
All right, I'm definitely not going to send this to Tim, the recording. I'm not sure he necessarily wants that. So this is a mathematician at Cambridge University. He's the W. Ball Professor at Cambridge. He's a leading mathematician. He's a recipient of the Fields Medal, which is sort of the big prize, the Nobel Prize in mathematics. And he's also a blogger. And this is his blog. It's a blog post actually from January of 2009. I should say this is not unusual, particularly amongst senior mathematicians. There are 42 living Fields medalists. 4 of them have started blogs. At least 4 have started blogs that I know of. And as befits sort of the blogosphere, 2 of them have subsequently abandoned those blogs, but 2 continue to use them pretty actively. And so he asked this very interesting question in January of 2009. Which is whether massively collaborative mathematics is possible or not. And what he proposed doing in this post was attacking a very difficult unsolved mathematical problem, a problem which he said he would love to solve, entirely in the open, using his blog as a medium to post ideas and partial progress. And what's more, he issued an open invitation inviting anybody in the world who had an idea that they thought they could contribute to post it in the comments section of the blog. And his hope was that they could make easy work of his hard mathematical problem. So as I said before, he called this experiment the Polymath Project. So it really got off to quite a slow start. In the first 7 hours or so, not a single person posted a suggestion or a comment. But then a mathematician from the University of British Columbia, Joseph Solomosi, posted, it's one idea, it's a little extended, but it was for a simplified version of the problem that might be interesting to attack and solve. And then 15 minutes later, a high school teacher, in fact, from Arizona, Jason Dyer, posted a short suggestion of his own. And 3 minutes after that, Terence Tao, another mathematician, this time from UCLA, also a Fields medalist actually, posted a comment. And so things were really often running. Actually, things kind of exploded. Over the next 37 days, 27 different people posted 800 substantive mathematical comments containing 170,000 words. That was on Gower's blog and Tao's blog, and a couple of others actually. Less was posted there. There was also a very active, extremely active wiki. It's a little hard to count words on such a thing because you've got changes being made all the time. So I don't have statistics there, but it was certainly extremely active. And so I was not really a serious participant in this, but I was watching very closely right from the very start, and it was really staggering to watch what happened. You'd see these ideas sort of very tentatively proposed at first by somebody, and then very rapidly developed and explored in all sorts of different directions. Often, of course, leading nowhere, or people would realize after a while that this was just not going to work, but also sometimes mutating or developing into full-blown insights into the problem. So Gowers, I think, summed it up rather nicely when he commented that it was to normal research as driving is to pushing a car. Having pushed a car some hundreds of meters up the road as a 16-year-old who'd run out of gas, yeah, it's an interesting description. So at the end of the 37 days, the reason I chose that time period is Gowers posted to his blog to announce that he believed that they had most likely solved the problem. They had to check still a bunch of little things to make sure they hadn't made any bad error, but indeed it turned out that everything checked out. They'd solved actually not just the original problem, but actually a harder generalization of the original problem. And so they did a few months cleanup work, checking everything, writing up papers. They wrote 2 papers ultimately out of this particular version of the project. There have been several subsequent follow-up projects as well, which I can talk about later. I won't try and summarize here. But the essential point is that the Polymath Project had achieved its aim, and really in quite remarkable time for a major mathematical result like this. So I'm just going to move away from the slides for a second. There's this sort of interesting question one can ask, and I know it's certainly asked here. What exactly is the internet for, or what are the broad classes of things which people can use the web or use the internet and associated protocols to do? And I guess there's this old dream, which I think you really see realized here, of using the net as a medium to build tools that actively amplify our collective intelligence. So both accelerating our ability to solve problems and perhaps also actually expanding the range of problems that we can solve at all. And so my subject today is how to do this in science and to what extent it is actually feasible. I will make a sort of one personal comment about my own history with this, which is I got on to the web in 1991 or 92, I think, fairly early on, although not right at the very start. And I looked at this as sort of a young scientist and thought, wow, this is really going to change everything. And sort of my experience is that 20 years later, we have a lot of PDFs of research papers up on the web, but surprisingly little change in many ways. That seems like kind of state of the art in some ways. I'm getting a few nods, and in fact a few wry smiles as well from people, so I'm maybe not the only person to think this. And this bothered me for a long time. And so finally, I guess in 2007, I decided, after having I was changing jobs at the time, and I had about a 2 or 3 month break to think about what was really important. And so I moved to my new job and decided that actually I wanted to work on open science, to work on network science full time. So after about 12 months in my new job, I decided to quit my tenured position and to work on this more or less full time. Anyway, so that's sort of some personal background. Let me move to a second story, which we can also learn something from. It's about an organisation called the Asset India Foundation. How many people are familiar with InnoCentive? Okay, a bunch, but not everybody. So this is a story that starts with a 23-year-old woman named Nita Umashankar. She just finished her undergraduate degree in Tucson, Arizona, 2003. And she went to live for a year in India. And what she did while she was there was she worked with a not-for-profit organisation trying to help young Indian women escape from prostitution. According to most estimates, there's hundreds of thousands of women involved in prostitution in India. Some estimates say millions. And what she found was very frustrating. It was that very few of these women had the skills necessary to hold down a job outside prostitution. So she came back at the end of her year to the United States, and she decided to start a new organisation that would address what she believed was the core problem by setting up training centres to train these young women in technology, and then actually to find them placement with some of India's big technology companies. And so 8 years later, and they've opened training centres in 5 big Indian cities, and they've helped several hundred young women find jobs in the technology sector. And what they'd like to do is to extend the program to many smaller Indian cities, but the problem that they have is that a lot of those cities don't have reliable electrical infrastructure, and if you're trying to run technology training centres, this is obviously something of a problem. So it's a problem for all the equipment that they use, but one thing that they were focused on was powering the wireless routers that they use to access the internet. And so they tried, it's possible to buy off-the-shelf solar-powered wireless routers, and they investigated that possibility. But for reasons which frankly I don't entirely understand, they were not suitable for the local conditions. And so they launched a search to try and find whether they could get something that was more suitable for them locally. And the way they addressed the problem ultimately was to connect with a company on the other side of the world, just outside Boston, named InnoCentive. And what InnoCentive is it's a marketplace for scientific problems. It's eBay or Craigslist, but instead of posting your old furniture for sale, you will post a bounty, or your organisation will post a bounty for a scientific problem. So probably, actually maybe the best known of the prizes is this prize, the Prize for Life, to find a biomarker for ALS, which has a very large prize, a $1 million prize. But most of the prizes are actually quite a bit smaller. $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 is a fairly typical prize for one of these things, for one of these problems. Anyway, ASSET went to the Rockefeller Foundation, who put up $20,000 in prize money for an InnoCentive challenge to design a low-cost, solar-powered wireless router that could be made with parts that they had locally available to them in India. So they broadcasted out to their network of solvers. InnoCentive advertises they have a couple of 100,000 solvers around the world. Of course, most of those are not active, so take that number with a grain of salt. But in any case, 400 people downloaded the challenge. I should explain what that means. Many more people saw sort of a broad description of the challenge. This is the really detailed discussion, who actually, kind of clicked through and downloaded all the gory details of what exactly the requirements were. So of those 400 people, 27 submitted solutions, and the winner was a man named Zachary Brown. So he's a 31-year-old software engineer in Texas, but he's not just any software engineer. He has a really interesting background. In his day job, he does a lot with open source software. In particular, he's an expert on using Linux to do systems work. And this matters if you want to design a cheap system, of course, that you have that kind of expertise. He also has as one of his big hobbies the construction of home wireless radio networks. And so he's built these things at home, and he's working towards a goal of making contact with every country in the world. He has a third hobby that's really interesting. When he was a kid, growing up, he watched on television as solar panels were installed at the Carter White House. And he told me in email that he'd asked his parents, what are they? And he'd been enthralled, that's his word, when they told him that they could take sunlight and convert it into electricity. So as an adult, he was using solar panels to power his home wireless radio networks, and he was actually hoping to power his whole home office this way, using Linux to run the whole kind of system. So, if you wanted to find one person in the world to attack this challenge, I think he'd certainly be on the short list. He obviously was really one of the right people. And all InnoCentive did was they provided a way of making that connection. So there's a real similarity here between this, where you found almost exactly the right person in the world to solve your problem, and what was going on in the Polymath Project. In the Polymath Project, you've assembled spontaneously, in no time flat, it took just a few days, a large group of experts who have much more expertise than any one individual. And what they're able to do, what the process that is going on iteratively, not just once as in the InnoCentive challenge, but what's going on over and over and over again, is that the right person's attention, the person with the right expertise, is being connected to the right problem at the right time. Somebody will say, here's my half-baked idea, and somebody else comes in, and they can't develop it any further. Somebody else comes in and says, oh, that reminds me of, and boom, you've gone a little bit further. And then again, and then again, and then again. So the kind of process that you see, certainly here, to some extent in the Polymath comments, and certainly in the development of open source software, is a kind of, it's like the serendipity that you see sometimes in solving research problems, but instead of happening randomly, it is happening by design at some level. So it is happening over and over again. You're getting this kind of conversational critical mass going. And the way I like to summarize this whole point of view is to say that what the tools are doing is they're helping us restructure expert attention. So what I mean by that, well, it's this process of connecting, when you have a problem, you're stuck on a little subproblem, it's the process of connecting to the right person at the right time so you can leverage their very specialized expertise. And I think that's what's in common between these two stories, and it's also in common with many other stories which you see around the web, this restructuring of expert attention. Basically, to put it in sort of economic terms, the chief scarce resource in solving a lot of creative problems is in fact the right expertise, is expertise. And so when you restructure expert attention, what you are doing is you're finding ways of more efficiently allocating it. It's actually maybe worth pointing out in this connection, it's interesting that you have this market structure. It's sort of almost a market for expert attention, to speak very loosely, in InnoCentive. Okay, so this is a very positive kind of a line of thought that I've been outlining. Let me switch and talk about some negatives. So this is a site that was set up by a colleague of mine at Caltech, a grad student named John Stockton. It was launched in August of 2005, called the Quickie, which stands for Quantum Wiki. And both John and I worked in quantum computing. And John's idea was that this would be kind of Wikipedia for quantum computing, sort of almost a super textbook type of a thing. So it'd be very rapidly evolving, constantly updated. It would contain all sorts of information about the big open problems at the absolute edge of the field. Hopefully, he hoped, people's ideas about how to attack them, their questions, their hunches, maybe details about what individual laboratories were able to do, sort of the innards, and this kind of idea. And he launched this at a workshop in August of 2005 at Caltech, which I happened to be at. And so I got a first-hand sense of how people responded to it. I talked to a bunch of people after the announcement. And some people were certainly very skeptical. What would you want to do that for? Sounds like a waste of time kind of response. There were a bunch more people who shrugged their shoulders and said, whatever. And then there was a substantial group of people, maybe not the majority overall, but definitely a very large group of people who were very excited by the possibility. They thought this was a terrific idea. Wouldn't it be great if we had a Wikipedia for quantum computing? Wouldn't it be great if there was a central repository of problems? These kinds of ideas were batted around. So you'd talk to people, excitedly for 5 or 10 minutes, and then, so what are you going to contribute to it? Or, do you have any plans? Oh no, I don't have time to do that. They were excited by the idea, but that didn't mean that they necessarily wanted to take the time themselves to contribute. That was not on the cards. And unfortunately, well, that meant, of course, that it failed. You had John Stockton providing a lot of initial information. He was able to convince a couple of people in his lab to also do that, but that was really pretty much it. And so you end up with a battle with spammers. I should say, by the way, one of the reasons I've chosen this as an example of something that fails is because it was good, right? He did not start. There are many, of course, terrible attempts to do things on the web. This is not one of them. He did a lot of things right. He worked very hard before launching to seed it with lots of interesting material. So he'd done a really good job on some core stuff, and he'd added a whole lot of stubs as well, where people could insert material. One of the things I guess people found on Wikipedia was that actually adding stubs has a real stimulating effect on other people. And he did sort of this job of marketing it and talking to the right people and trying to twist arms. He tried to twist my arm to add a bunch of content to it, and I saw him talking very persuasively to other people. But it still failed. And this story has just been repeated so many times in science with science wikis. I could give you 50 examples. I'll give you 3. There's the Not Atlas, which failed for many of the same reasons. There's the String Theory Wiki, which failed for many of the same reasons. There have been ideas to develop scientific social networks, kind of the Facebook for Scientists idea is how it's often described quickly. The idea being that make it easy to find people with complementary research interests so you can share code, share data, share ideas. And people have done a terrific job developing some of these sites, put a lot of effort, a lot of thought into doing it, and just one after the other, they've failed. You go to a lot of the sites, and here's an example. 250,000 experts active in the community. 300,000 scientists have joined. One here from the AIP, the American Institute of Physics, 60,000 people. And you create an account, log in, and you can't find anybody. There's lots of profiles, but you can't actually find anybody else who seems to be active on the site. And it really is, it's a virtual ghost town. And what seems to be going on behind the scenes in a lot of these is that they're going to scientific societies and saying, can we have your membership database, please? And then they automatically pre-populate the site, so they get their 300,000 or their 60,000 or whatever. And that's why they're ghost towns. But a lot of those people, of course, have never even logged in once. and certainly aren't regular users. So I think this is terrible. I mean, regardless of the merits of individual sites, I think it's a real pity. Just give me a second. Everybody in the room, I'm sure, understands what's going on, but let me just spell it out. Particularly if you're a young scientist, pre-getting a permanent job, or you're still getting postdocs or whatever, there's a cost-benefit calculation going on here. You might think the idea of the Quickie is a terrific idea in principle, but you know that when your CV is being evaluated by that hiring committee or by that grant agency or whoever, a long slew of truly brilliant contributions to the Quickie is not going to be worth anything like as much as one mediocre scientific paper. And so of course you allocate your time to writing, well, hopefully not mediocre scientific papers, but there is this, this calculus that is certainly going on. It's the calculus that I witnessed firsthand when talking to people about the Quickie. I have other things that I need to do. It is not my job to be doing this kind of thing. And that's repeated over and over and over again. And so you might say, well, doesn't this contradict what I said earlier about InnoCentive and the Polymath Project? Actually, it doesn't contradict it at all. It fits right into that story. The Polymath Project was using an unconventional means to achieve a conventional end. They published 2 papers at the end of that, which of course are on the CVs of the leading contributors. And InnoCentive is appealing to an even more basic motivation, get your $20,000. So it really does fit into the story. And it's terrific that those projects are succeeding, and obviously I think it's very valuable and very exciting, but it means that there are a lot of possibilities that we're not exploring, that are being taken off the table. So the problem with the Quickie is that at the end of the day, it's being constructed as an entity in itself. It does not lead to this other outcome, the outcome for which young scientists are rewarded, the outcome for which they have all the incentives to work. So I certainly think that this means that there are a lot of very interesting possibilities that we're not exploring. Let me tell you, this seems like a very difficult situation, a very difficult sort of a problem to resolve. I'll tell you 2 stories, I guess, about instances where it's been resolved spectacularly in some sense. How many people are familiar with the Bermuda Principles? Anybody? Okay. All right, so let me give you an example that's very much like the Quickie. It's actually the Human Genome Project and the fact that you can get the data from the human genome. So this is kind of peculiar. If you're a biologist who's taking genetic data, why are you going to upload that data and share it online to one of the big databases, GenBank or one of the other major databases? You are not, you're not evaluated in that way. You are not rewarded for sharing your data in that kind of a way. And there's a story behind it. It's the story of the Bermuda Principles. Basically, in the early 1990s, all the leading molecular biologists could see that the human genome was certainly going to be sequenced. There was no doubt about that. Everybody could also see that while it was not in their individual best interests to share the data, it was in the collective interest of the community as a whole, and not to mention the human race as a whole. And so there was this interesting sort of discussion that was taking place at the time, which has many wrinkles to it, but the key point from my point of view is that in 1996 they got together with the support of the Wellcome Trust and the support of the NIH in Bermuda. Many of the leaders, including members of the Human Genome Project, Craig Venter, who would later lead the private project to sequence the genome, they were all present, and they talked about this for days. And people would say, I am willing in principle to share my data, but only if everybody else does. I am not going to unilaterally go ahead myself. And they codified this. They wrote down 3 principles, which essentially state, these Bermuda Principles, they essentially state that if anybody who takes more than a kilobase or 1,000 base pairs of data from the laboratory must upload it to GenBank or a similar site within 24 hours. and the resulting data would be put into the public domain. Right? And this wasn't just talk, it wasn't just words on paper, because the representatives from the Wellcome Trust and from the NIH went back and they baked it into policy at those agencies. And if you wanted to get money to work on the Human Genome Project, you needed to agree to abide by the Bermuda Principles. That was a year or so later. Right, so that's why you can take your iPhone now and download the human genome. I should say, actually, it didn't just go to the highest levels at those grant agencies. In fact, it went even higher, interestingly enough. In 2000, just after they'd announced the sequencing of the human genome, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton issued a joint statement. They don't name the Bermuda Principles, but they do describe them in the joint statement. They praise them very heavily, and they urge that every single country in the world adopt the same principles. And if you look since, there have been several sort of similar agreements made by by those grant agencies that kind of extend the original Bermuda Principles to other types of genetic data sharing. But despite that, there's an awful lot of species of life for which, here's all scientific knowledge. And of course, the human genome is just a tiny, 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 tiny fraction. It's only a tiny fraction even of genetic data. And for most genomes, there's no similar agreement in place, and so people still hoard data. There's a bioinformatician I know, a fantastic guy. He's released all kinds of open source software projects. He's very in favor of open science in principle, but he told me rather sheepishly after a talk that he'd been, quote, sitting on the genome for an entire species for more than a year. So I should say, I won't name the species. You'll be able to identify him, but it's a species you've heard of. This is not something obscure. And his collaborators don't want him to release it. So it's sitting there, kind of rotting away, basically, on his hard disk. I talked to him recently, and he said, yeah, 18 months and counting. So he's still going. So, we do have this big break towards openness, sort of evinced by the Bermuda Principles, but there's obviously a long way to go. Even things like influenza, for example, you'd think, yeah.
Sorry, aren't you leaving out the central role of publishers in all of this? Because the publishers also insisted that people deposit before they could publish.
So that was a consequence, is my understanding of the...
Right, I think it's become a very important driving force.
Absolutely, and in fact, I guess in some fields, not just in genomics, there are sort of publisher mandates. When you submit your paper, you have to agree, or you have to actually indicate that you've deposited in the appropriate, the protein data bank or whatever the appropriate database is. Same basic story though, in that it's not across all fields, or it's a long way from being across all fields. An interesting thing actually about the Bermuda Principles in this connection is that it was within 24 hours of taking the data, not within 24 hours of publication, but a long, long time before that. So that's actually, it's much more restrictive than It's much more, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but it's a very strong requirement on the scientists involved. It's kind of interesting in that regard. That's something that I think only the funders have the capacity to do. The journals, it would be much harder for them to impose that kind of requirement on scientists. Okay, so that's kind of story number one about a big change, which I think is an interesting change. The second, actually I'll go back, is the origin of modern science itself. So a little story in this connection, which is about Galileo. So 1609, Galileo constructs his first astronomical telescope. And he spends some time looking at Jupiter and the Sun and various other things. And finally, in July of 1610, for the first time as far as we know, he pointed it at Saturn. And instantly, first night, he sees what we now know are the rings of Saturn. So he sees Saturn with two little bumps on the side. He can't actually make out the rings. That had to wait for Huygens some years later. Galileo does not announce this in any way, shape or form to the world. Instead, he writes 5 letters, actually, as far as we know. It seems like essentially within 24 hours of doing this. So 4 of those letters go to astronomer colleagues, including Kepler, the great Johannes Kepler. And what Galileo did was he wrote down a description of the discovery, and then he scrambled the letters into an anagram, and he sends it off to Kepler and these other colleagues. And what this means is that if Kepler makes the same discovery later, well, Galileo can unscramble the anagram and claim the credit. But in the meantime, he's bought some time in which he can continue to do his work, or to build on this discovery. Actually, the fifth letter goes to his patrons, the Medici, explaining the discovery in full, crowing loudly about it, and begging them not to publicly reveal the information, promising, of course, that it will be released for their greater glory later, but please, not yet. I need more time. And so I guess the way scientists often think about it is, well, this all changed once we introduced scientific journals just a little bit later, 1665. The first scientific journals are introduced, people like Henry Oldenburg at the Royal Society. But here's what Mary Bowers Hall, Oldenburg's biographer, had to say about that. Oldenburg would, quote, beg for information, sometimes writing simultaneously to two competing scientists on the grounds that it would be best to tell A what B was doing and vice versa, in the hopes of stimulating both men at the time, to more work and more openness. And she tells some sort of interesting stories. Oldenburg was, I guess, honest, but maybe a bit tricky in how he would do this. He would write to one leading scientist and sort of insinuate that some other leading scientist working on closely related problems was a bit ahead of where they really were. At that point, you have no reason to hold back or to be secretive. Instead, you have to disclose, oh, that I know how to do that too. And the best way to do that is to write a letter explaining how to do it. And meanwhile, Oldenburg would kind of bounce this backwards and forwards, and then would publish distillations of the letters in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Quite a thing to be doing, because there was no incentive for the people at the time to actually publish. They were very reluctant to do so. There's another great quote from one of the scholars of the printing press, Elizabeth Eisenstein. So she's talking about the early history. Exploitation of the mass medium, books, was more common among pseudoscientists and quacks than among Latin-writing professional scientists, who often withheld their work from the press. So this, of course, is 220 years after Gutenberg. Not exactly next week. 220 years after, scientists are still amongst the most sort of regressive users of the printing press. They were very reluctant to embrace journals. And the transition took decades and a lot of pressure from people like Oldenburg. Paul David at Stanford has taken a good long look at this and has written a very nice 120-page paper looking at how scientists first embraced open science back then. If you, kind of a way of looking at it is to say that in some sense the journal system is the most open system you could possibly construct for sharing scientific information if all you have available is 17th century technology. And according to David's analysis, the crucial factor, he believes, was essentially what in modern terms we'd call funder pressure, or back then it was patron pressure. So pressure from people like the Medicis. Just to give you one very small example of this, Galileo, he didn't announce Saturn, but he did announce the 4 moons of Jupiter, which were one of the very first things that he found. Publicly, he wrote a little pamphlet which he arranged to have published very quickly, almost immediately. It was like 6 weeks or so after he'd made the discovery. Made him famous all over Europe. And the story behind that is he was either without a patron at the time or he was very unhappy with his patron at the time. And he wanted to get the Medici for patrons. And so he actually wrote letters to the Medici saying, look, I'm going to make you famous. I'm going to name these moons after you. And for this to be successful, obviously he had to actually to publish. And so there's this interesting negotiation took place that did indeed result in him being kind of adopted and funded by the Medici. But it was all done on condition that he make the Grand Duke, Cosimo, famous in this kind of way. And so it was through many, many such acts of pressure from funders who have different incentives to the individuals that in fact it became common for scientists to share share things in the modern way, basically, where we have this situation that a scientist's reputation is built by publication. And of course, what I think we need today is to expand this notion of open science so that people are not just sharing their, the things that can be shoehorned into this journal publication format, but so that they're also sharing their research, the code that they write in the course of research, so that they're sharing their data, so that they're sharing their hunches, their ideas, their questions, basically all the scientific knowledge that's trapped inside their heads and inside their laboratories, putting it out on the network in a form where it can be processed and taken full advantage of. Now, I have a final component to the talk, which is about actions. I think what I'm going to do actually, because it's a small group, I'm going to cut myself off here. I'd actually prefer maybe to have a discussion for the next 15 or 20 minutes, and we can talk about actions. It's also, of course, a very sophisticated group, and so people no doubt have many thoughts of their own about exactly what can be done, and it might be better, I think, to move to discussion. Does that seem like a good plan to you?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So thank you all. And yeah, let's.
I mean, if I can kick it off, I mean, I think it's discouraging that we have to rely on top-down direction, either by journals or by funders or whatever. I mean, it seems like it truly open science, or there should be, perhaps, yeah, there should be. We also, and from a perspective of academic freedom, there should be the personal incentive to do this rather than I do it because I have to because my funder requires me to. I think that's a fundamental problem.
So a real limitation of relying on funder mandates for, say, open data sharing is, it gets you some fraction of the way, but let me make it really concrete, actually. If you're sharing genetic data, it's really clear what those genetic data are. But if you're sharing data from, say, an atomic physics laboratory, you need all sorts of really complicated calibration information and all sorts of other stuff, all sorts of metadata, all sorts of, there's a long list of things you need. And so you can't mandate that people share that in a way that's really truly reusable by other people, because people it's too easy to evade. You can evade a letter of the law, but actually make your data essentially useless to other people. So I completely agree. The only way you can actually get this to work is mandates take you some fraction of the way, but you need people to actually actively embrace it. And so an example one can give, it's a very small example, but it is nonetheless an example, is in physics. How many people are familiar with the preprint archive in physics? Okay, quite a lot, but not everybody. The preprint archive is an online site in physics that's been running for 20 years now, where physicists upload preprints of their papers, so they're not refereed, nothing like that, and other people can download them. So they're not sort of first-class objects in the same sense that papers are. But part of what's driven the adoption of preprints is that actually there's a very influential service in physics which tracks citations between papers. It's been doing this for 40 years, and they made the decision in the early 90s to start tracking citations not just between papers, but also between preprints. And so if you're sitting in a hiring meeting in physics, everybody will be there with their laptops out, furiously looking at the Spire's citation records for these people. And so, particularly at their very latest work, which is only available on the preprint archive, it's not yet in the journals. How has what they've done in the last year or two been impacting other people? And you can figure it out. And so this is helping drive the adoption. People are internalizing this as an incentive. I mean, it's a tiny thing because a preprint is so similar to a paper at some level, but it's the kind of transition that would have seemed, I think, impossible without actually just without seeing it happen like this. So that kind of, if you measure the impact of new types of knowledge sharing, then people will start to pay attention, they'll start to look at it on hiring committees and whatnot, and then there's an incentive. People will internalise the incentive, and they start to share enthusiastically in those ways. That's my answer to your question anyway.
Do you know the example of one site called My Experiment? So it's marine biology.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of successful.
I was in Manchester yesterday, actually, talking with the people who run it.
I only saw it. I don't
Yeah.
about the ways of changing.
Yeah.
I've seen at least here in Oxford. So I work in computational cardiac physiology.
Yeah.
And some of the senior scientists already have a more open mind, and they talk about when looking for a candidate for a place or a position, to take into consideration the work they have been doing in open projects.
Oh, really?
So that's, well, but of course this is people that may be early adopters of, with that are opening their mind now more fast than other people. But at least some changes, at least is being talked about or starting to happen.
So can you just say again what field that's in? That's
Computational biology, computational physiology. There's a group mainly in the working with the heart.
okay.
Dennis Noble and his group. And
Dennis Noble, Dennis Noble in his group, and the group that is all around.
Arthur, you're involved with, were involved with that, or?
Yeah,
Yes,
well,
yes.
continue to be.
Continue to be, yeah.
Okay. Do you have a explanation of what's going on there, or why are they doing it?
Well, it's certainly partly due to the personalities involved, there's no doubt
Yeah.
about that. But I think it's also because computational biology in some ways is different from experimental biology.
Yeah.
Because people spend much of their lives actually writing code, they recognize that the code in some sense embodies their scientific theory. And so they have every incentive in the world to expose that code for people to evaluate. So as a consequence, for example, in that particular project, in the OERC and in Department of Computer Science, I guess we now have to call it instead of ComLab, they've just released best part of 1 million lines of code
Have they?
for doing this kind of modeling.
Yeah.
It's a huge effort. It's a
Yeah.
huge engineering effort. They've been lucky in that they've had funding to do that. And I think it was the commitment to release not just the code, but also the models that the code ran, the models of these various physiological systems, was instrumental in getting significant European funding.
Yeah.
Without that commitment, I don't think the project would have happened.
Do you know how they're releasing? How are they releasing the code?
Just in a very straightforward way. There's a tarball, you can download it, and
Okay.
there's a
I'm
wiki.
just thinking there are
There's a
very social tools which can be used to release code as well,
Sure.
which make it much
They're
easier to
doing it in
discover.
a very sort of way. Now,
and so
on the other hand, the
Okay.
models.
So it's a tarball.
We talked about my experiment.
Yeah.
The models that are really the core of all of this. I mean, the code is just simulation code, but the models are the essential scientific understanding. And of course, those are being released through the CellML repository, which is maintained by the University of Auckland. And that's along with biomodels.net at the EBI and various other places. The whole SBML effort, the sort of system biology modeling language effort.
So you said
There's a lot of enthusiasm for this kind of openness.
So you said that the models were being released by a repository in Auckland. Did you say?
Yeah.
Did I hear that right? Oh, interesting.
There's a very strong computational modeling group,
Okay.
computational physiology group there. And
Yeah.
the Human Physiome Project actually started more or less in Auckland.
Yeah, I guess I think that it's very interesting all the effort that's been put into developing institutional repositories by sort of libraries all over the world. There is a discovery problem, which is you need to know that you go to Auckland. I'm trying to imagine the open source software community, if they'd adopted a similar model, right? Every city would have its own repository, and it would be very hard to find.
But there are actually meta repositories.
Yeah.
There's biomodels.net, for example,
Sure.
maintained by the EBI, which is basically a repository of links to repositories. In
Yeah.
the same way, there's a huge effort in the biology ontology community.
Yeah, sure.
The so-called open biology, open biontology foundries.
Yeah.
To expose all of these things in a kind of coherent global.
Yeah.
global
Yeah,
way.
it seems
Sorry,
inevitable that
I don't
that's
mean
going to happen.
If
It was
I
a
can
good
add just a comment, even at this level, we have problems with the opening of the data, because all the models are done, the parameters for the models, and all the models are based on experimental data. And so we collaborate with many people, with experimentalists, with physiologists, with medical doctors, and so on. And some of them don't want to disclose the data. So
Yeah.
you can have models, the model is available, but the raw data is not available. So this area is kind of in the level of defining the metadata, forms for metadata, how to use them and to share them. But also one of the main problems is to have the raw data that was used to build the model, so that you can really reproduce all the process. So you can, starting from the raw data and reproduce how the model was constructed and test different things. So here we also have still this problem, but it's quite developed already.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of this whole exercise was, and this is work that Penny Noble has been doing for many years, is that if you try to take models that are described in the literature and actually run them, you don't produce the results that are
Sure.
in the papers.
Sure.
Well-known problem, I'm sure, in other fields,
Yeah.
but you know, it amplifies the point that
Yeah.
if you don't have access to the raw data,
There's a
then even checking whether the models actually run correctly.
Yeah.
Is
I think there's a whole lot of problems down the track that are going to come associated with that. I mean, there's at least I think there's at least 2 efforts to construct open climate models for more or less this reason. And there's also, I was having a conversation yesterday, a real problem in future is going to be, more and more we rely on web services when you're writing code. So you make a call to somebody else's machine, or maybe actually to several other services. They in turn make calls to several other services, which in turn make calls to several other services. And 10 years ago, this kind of work, of course, was almost completely unknown. Now it's becoming standard, and in 10 years' time, I think it's very clear that it will be sort of have taken over the world in terms of the programming community. But it's going to make reproducing analyses really interesting because you don't actually understand the dependencies. You know that you're using some server over there at NCBI, but you don't understand what else it's calling out there in the world. That it's also calling Amazon, who are calling Google, who are calling, etc., etc., etc. And so it may become impossible to rerun analyses. I think that's a really interesting kind of possibility for the future.
So you described the free rider problem that was
Yeah.
experienced by the Knot and the Quickie site
Yeah.
as overcome in the Bermuda project because of what you might think of as a Hobbesian solution, a strong sovereign. You've got
Indeed.
the NIH coming in. yeah?
Absolutely.
And then the answer
Sort
to
of the Leviathan, in fact.
Leviathan, yeah. And the answer to the Polymath one was more of a status solution. Yeah, but my impression.
Hang on, unpack that. What do you mean?
So as in people saw themselves getting credit
Okay.
for their contributions.
To a paper,
in the
ultimately.
form of a paper,
Yeah.
yeah, which is a currency that these scientists
Yeah.
care about. But my impression was, at least at the beginning there, the contributors didn't see themselves as working towards that as an end. I don't know the history of it, but I'd be interested in knowing at what stage they then saw this as an incentive. And
Yeah.
up until then, sort of, who was contributing? Was it high status actors in the field? It sounds like some fields medalists, but
Yeah.
low status.
So there are several different questions there. Let me unpack. Well, easy question first. There's a wide distribution. Most of the people who ultimately were making frequent contributions were, they were professional mathematicians at a variety of different levels of status. You had some very high status mathematicians. You also had some people who were kind of known in their field, but not necessarily sort of at that same level. And so it was a very broad range. In terms of, you don't see, people are not making explicit their desire to publish a paper. There's not a sort of a discussion. I think the right way maybe of answering that part of your question is there was certainly a spirited discussion of notions around authorship and what we will do with any papers that come out of this project before the project started. Right? So that was done up front, and there's no doubt that it was of interest to certainly many of the people who were involved. If you look at the discussion, so it was discussed in front. Of course, for the mathematicians involved, I don't they don't think of, I don't as a theoretical physicist, I don't think of myself as, I'm not explicitly thinking most of the time anyway, I'm going to write a paper and that's why I'm doing it. I've internalized the notion that I should solve problems and publish solutions, but of course I'm thinking about solving the problem. That's the first order challenge most of the time. In fact, I'm not even thinking about solving the problem. I'm thinking about solving some sub problem that hopefully will help me. But still in the back of my mind is that understanding that there's, I'm participating in an economy there. And I think that's my reading of what was taking place. It was interesting. There was, in the mathematical part of the project, it was carried out with truly remarkable kind of goodwill and candor, and I mean, I can't say enough about that. But in the pre-discussion, there was some interesting interjections from people who felt very strongly about issues around authorship and these kinds of things. I should say, actually, as far as I could tell, none of the people who made very strong interjections participated significantly in the project eventually, but they still wanted to make their feelings known, and yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have a related thing about the Bermuda principles in that you mentioned the rapid release side of things, and I'm interested whether they either formally or informally have any rules or norms around how you publish from that. If it's come out and then you have to write a paper.
Polymath? From Bermuda? Oh.
Yeah, like so if it's really rapidly released and nobody's written the paper but they have to put the data out.
Yeah.
Did anything arise around that to say, well, we wait 6 months before we've got an idea for a paper from that data, we'll wait 6 months, or are they all in consortia?
That's a really interesting
How do they
question.
manage that?
So I've kind of talked that over a little bit with some people who they do sequencing.
Yeah.
Not in enough depth to state with any confidence what the answer is, but the sense I got was that some kind of informal agreements arose or understandings arose that sure, the data was being released, but it was polite to wait for other people to publish their paper about that specific stuff. You could use it to do other things, but there were certain kinds of basic analyses that you let them have their space, basically. But as I say, first of all, I'm not a biologist. I don't really understand a lot of the issues, and it's more an impression than anything else. Actually, you might be able to speak to it.
It's partly the fact that even though you said that the genomic data is what it is, in some sense it isn't, because again you need to understand the context.
All the annotation and all this kind of stuff.
All the experimental conditions under which those data were generated have a huge influence on how you go about interpreting it.
Sure.
And that stuff, of course, doesn't get submitted.
Sure. I think even so, in sort of when you compare it to other kinds of scientific data, it is still some of the easiest stuff to understand out of its original context. You look at a good example actually there's more and more astronomical data which is being taken and made open. Sloan Digital Sky Survey is perhaps the canonical example of that, but there are many other examples. And all of these projects go through an incredible, there is a cost to making that data understandable. There's always at least one deep paper that they write explaining the effort they went to do calibration, much more stringent than they would otherwise do, and to make that data available so people can actually say, geez, it must have been a cloudy night that night, or there's a little bit more water in the atmosphere that night, or whatever, and that's affecting the way we understand these. That kind of extra data is absolutely essential, and when you're just using the data yourself, of course, people make, I've done it myself, you make all sorts of corrections that you never record anywhere. It's all kept, it's very much tacit knowledge that doesn't escape the laboratory. And so that's a real cost of opening up data sets. There's an interesting cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done.
But I mean, a lot of the genetic stuff also needs the phenotypic information, which is the same kind of information as that. Releasing the genetic information is only useful if you're interested just in sequencing genes. It's not at all useful if you're trying to discover diseases, because you need the phenotypic data to say which parts of the population have diseases and so forth, and that stuff isn't released at the same speed. So I used to work in that area.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I'm just making a very basic statement about the, at least you can understand the base pairs kind of relatively straightforward fashion, but there's all sorts of context that ultimately you want. Yeah. I agree.
One or two more questions?
I think he was first.
Okay, Grant?
Sure. Oh.
Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So when I want to ask a question about how open is open, and the kind of the real question is, in the first example, Timothy Gower's example, you kind of showed the picture of the high school maths teacher who contributed an initial idea. Did he get onto the authorship? And in the context of mathematics, there's a great history of amateur mathematicians.
Yeah.
But I mean, we don't have many amateur molecular biologists probably. And
You do now.
Oh boy, I've met maybe 30 or 40 amateur molecular biologists in the last week.
Okay, so I'm asking a question about in the second open science revolution that you're saying we need. What is there? Do we go back to the days when Fermat might have published his letters as an amateur mathematician, and gotten credit, and that doesn't fit into the modern publishing cycle or citation, and there's no benefit for an amateur scientist is not kind of part of the reward structure that exists, or that you might be positing. I'm not sure.
There are several different questions.
Yeah, exactly. Should make more clear.
Sorry, I wasn't careful enough actually in noting the question. So,
Authorship.
at least part. Yeah, thank you. Awesome.
Yeah.
No summary. So, certainly, I mean, the case of Polymath, your question before about norms. Yeah, there's a very interesting and difficult question to be addressed there. So much of the discussion around authorship initially was, what should we do? If we publish a paper, what are we going to do? And so their chosen answer was, well, let's try just using a pseudonym. So DHJ Polymath. The problem they were solving was the density Hale-Stewart theorem, so DHJ. And you might say, well, why not just list everybody? Well, some people didn't really contribute very much at all. On that list of 27 contributors, I think if you were to rank people according to the magnitude of their contribution, number 27 would probably be me. I did make one substantive comment, which probably saved somebody a good 5 minutes or so, I'm guessing. But yeah, there's no way I should be an author on any paper. But the problem is that 26 contributes a little bit more than me, and 25 a little bit more than them, and so on. There isn't the same kind of cutoff that you get in a closed collaboration, where you have a few people who you chatted to who get in the acknowledgements, and otherwise. So it's a very difficult problem to solve, and so their attempt at establishing a new norm was to take this approach of a pseudonym. It's actually very similar to what takes place in high energy high energy particle physics. You have a paper with 800 authors. Everybody knows that means, some of those people designed new detector systems for it over a period of 5 years. Other people, sharpened pencils, and they have the same status on the paper. So everybody understands that doesn't really mean anything. You rely on letters of recommendation. And the same thing is certainly going to take place, I think, here. There are some people, junior mathematicians, who made crucial contributions to the Polymath Project, who are going to get some very nice letters of recommendation. Do you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a different version of the authorship question, sort of a more meta question on that. You refer a couple of times to extraordinary goodwill, to quote you, and people letting themselves having their space. And you're using mathematics as your opening example here. It's a notably unpoliticized particular problem. But what happens when science becomes politicized, or when there become the very common situation, even beyond politics, where two papers contradict each other, and two groups? I mean, easy to find examples of a great deal of bad blood that has resulted from that over.
Can you give me a concrete example of what you're talking about?
Oh gosh, well,
So
you can take the modern examples, any number of climate change papers.
Sure.
The most recent one with the remote sensing paper that you're probably aware of.
I'm not actually.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But I'm certainly aware of some of
there are a
the
number
battles
of
that have
others,
taken
right.
place.
I mean, so where you have a situation where, to summarize quickly, sort of the journal version of how you handle that is you do a comment and response to the article. And the blog version, where a lot of the climate change material, for example, is debated, tends to attract large numbers of people who are probably not particularly knowledgeable about anything involved, any of the particular issues involved. So they're not what in a journal would be considered to be competent to comment on the issue. It also tends to attract a lot of ad hominem and other politicized attacks which don't deal with the issues of data or theory or methods that underlie the science.
Sure. It's kind of the human equivalent of spam.
Okay, yeah, instead of the human equivalent of spam, without kind of the, a nice filter that you can attach to your Gmail. This strikes me as a real significant issue, and there's no obvious clean solution. I mean, not that the journal solution of comment and response is all that clean, because that certainly hasn't erased the problem. But how would talk a little bit about how this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful issue. So to draw back, to step back a little from the climate example. The climate example is, of course, an
egregiously intense example.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at because of that, but it's also interesting to step back and so you can say, to what extent in the Polymath project was there a problem with the well-intentioned but uninformed coming in and saying, I have a great idea, da-da-da-da. So in version 1, actually that was almost not a problem at all. I looked at every single comment and tried to determine whether or not it was substantive or not. And the number of insubstantive comments was negligible. I don't actually remember the exact number, but it was not. There was no signal to noise problem in the project. If you look at later iterations of the project, it rises a little bit, and you might wonder, well, if they keep doing this in 5 years' time, are they going to, they're going to spend 50% of, is 50% of their time going to be spent ignoring this? Now, the solutions that I know, everybody certainly knows that if you go into, depending on which internet forum you go into, you will get a very different sort of an experience. YouTube comments are famously bad, and the reasons for that, it's a very interesting mix of technical things, technical design. Certainly, there's no doubt that you could influence the quality a lot merely with sometimes very small technical tweaks, but there's also, of course, a massive social component to it, both in terms of shared norms, which are widely shared across society, and also the behaviour of single individuals. So, for example, Gowers was just exceedingly polite, really, I mean, he set an amazing tone, as did Terence Tao and a couple of the other high-status people. It just would have felt strange, frankly, to write a nasty comment in this kind of context. So that's a case where it's not a sort of a societal norm so much as it is the behaviour of the leading contributors. So I think where I'm going with this is that there's a much more general question, which is how do we get civil discourse online? And that the right answer to that kind of question is going to combine both social factors and also technical factors. I know of people, and there's probably some very interesting other examples people could point me to here, but there are certainly instances where somebody running a very successful, very popular online forum is putting a great deal of effort into making it really function very well. One I participate in heavily is just a little website called Hacker News, which has, I guess, 160,000 people reading it. And it's remarkable, the quality. They certainly get people who are not, they get their trolls and whatnot. But the site has been so designed that that just disappears very frequently. So I think there's hope, but that's not to underestimate the size of the problem. It's a big one. It's a big one.
I'm afraid that one of the few incentives I've created for Michael coming is a free lunch. And we may lose that incentive if we continue much longer. But may we thank you again.